Kofi Obeng looked quiet, just a gentle giant working the stables, hands steady, eyes soft. But the men in white hoods only saw his size, not the past he carried across an ocean, not the scars on his arms that whispered who he used to be. They tried to corner him under a moonlit field, laughing as they closed in. But something changed when Kofi turned toward them, calm, silent, moving with a precision no farmhand should know. In that moment, the hunters felt hunted, and they fled into the dark, shaken by a man who hadn't even raised a fist. What they saw as weakness was restraint. What they thought was fear was patience. Because Kofi Obeng wasn't just big, he was trained, disciplined. A former warrior from an elite African regiment feared across entire kingdoms, and when the clan came back for him, and for the innocent people he protected, Kofi finally stopped holding back. This is the story of what happens when men blinded by hate awaken the warrior they never understood and cannot control. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The morning mist still clung to the ground when Kofi Obeng stepped from his cabin. Dawn barely touched the sky. A few stars remained visible through the pine branches overhead. His boots, worn leather, sizes too small for his feet, crushed the damp grass beneath him as he walked. 7 feet tall, maybe more. He moved with a strange quietness for someone his size, each step deliberate, each movement controlled. His shadow stretched long across the dirt path leading toward the plantation stables. The air smelled of wet earth and pine sap. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed. Kofi reached the stable doors and slid them open. The familiar scent of hay and animal warmth greeted him. 3 mules stood in their stalls, ears twitching at his arrival. He spoke softly to them in a language nobody in Arkansas had ever heard. The words flowed gentle and rhythmic. The mules calmed immediately. He began his work. Water buckets first, then fresh hay, then checking hooves for stones or injuries. His hands, massive, scarred, moved with surprising tenderness as he lifted each animal's leg. The mules trusted him completely. They never kicked, never bit. They seemed to understand he meant no harm. "Morning, Kofi." The voice came from behind him. Tom Bridges stood in the doorway, hat in hand. A small man, thin shoulders, kind eyes that had seen too much sadness. "Morning, Tom," Kofi replied. His voice was deep but quiet. He rarely spoke above a whisper. Tom stepped inside and grabbed a pitchfork. "Heard some new folks came back from the war. Veterans, staying at the boarding house near town." Kofi said nothing. He continued brushing down the largest mule. "They've been asking questions," Tom continued. He kept his voice low. "About you, mostly. Wondering how a man gets so tall. Wondering where you came from." "I came from here," Kofi said simply. Tom nodded. He knew better than to press. Kofi never talked about his past, never spoke of where he learned to move the way he did, never explained the strange scars that covered his forearms, patterns that looked deliberate, ritual. "Just thought you should know," Tom said. "People notice you, Kofi. Can't help it." "I know." They worked in silence for a while. The sun rose higher. Light streamed through the stable's cracks and gaps. Dust particles floated in the beams like tiny stars. Outside, voices approached. 3 men, maybe 4. Their boots crunched on gravel. One of them laughed, loud and sharp. The sound made the mules nervous. Kofi glanced toward the door, but didn't stop working. The men appeared in the entrance, all white, all wearing clothes that looked military but weren't quite uniforms anymore. One had a scar across his jaw. Another walked with a slight limp. The one in front was different, shorter than the others. His face held a permanent scowl. His eyes moved constantly, like he expected attack from every direction. "Earl Whitlock," Kofi had seen him before. The man owned a small farm 3 miles east. The crops always looked sickly. The fences always sagged. "That him?" Earl asked, pointing at Kofi. The limping man nodded. "Tallest slave I ever seen." They stared. Kofi felt their eyes measuring him, judging him, searching for weakness or threat. He kept brushing the mule, steady, calm. His hands never shook. "How tall you reckon?" the scarred man asked. 7 feet, Earl said. "Maybe more." "Jesus!" Earl stepped closer. His boots stopped just outside the stall. "Hey, you! What's your name?" Kofi looked up slowly. His eyes met Earl's for just a moment. Then he looked back down at the mule. "Kofi!" "Kofi!" Earl repeated, mocking the pronunciation. "What kind of name is that?" "Mine," Kofi said quietly. The other men laughed. Earl didn't. His jaw tightened. Something about Kofi's calmness seemed to irritate him deeply. "You always work here?" Earl asked. "Yes, sir." "Where you from originally?" "Here." "Don't lie to me, boy. Nobody grows that tall just eating cornmeal and molasses." Kofi said nothing. He moved to the next mule and began checking its hooves. Earl's face reddened. "I'm talking to you." "I heard you," Kofi said. Still quiet, still steady. The tension in the stable thickened. Tom Bridges had moved to the far corner, trying to become invisible. The veterans shifted their weight. Hands moved closer to their belts. Then Earl turned away, suddenly. "Come on, let's go." They left. Their voices faded down the path. Tom exhaled slowly. "That man's got meanness in him, Kofi." "I know. He looking for trouble." "I know that too." By afternoon, the rumors had spread through town like wildfire. At the general store, 2 women whispered about seeing a giant shadow near the pine woods after dark. At the barber shop, men debated whether Kofi was dangerous or just simple. At the church steps, mothers warned their children to stay away from the old logging road where the tall slave sometimes walked. Nobody knew the truth about Kofi Obeng. Nobody knew where he came from or what he'd been before arriving in Arkansas. They only knew he was big, different, quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Fear grew in the empty spaces where knowledge should have been. That evening, Earl Whitlock sat in a barn 3 miles from the plantation. 3 men sat with him. They wore no hoods yet, but the white fabric lay folded on a table between them. "We need to remind folks how things work," Earl said. His voice carried an edge of desperation. "Can't have uppity slaves thinking they can just exist however they want." "The big one?" asked the scarred man. "Especially the big one," Earl confirmed. "Tonight, we corner him, scare him proper, make sure he understands his place." The men nodded. They'd done this before. They knew the script, a few threats, maybe a few punches. Then the target would bow and scrape and promise to behave. Power restored, order maintained. They had no idea what they were actually planning to confront. After dinner, Kofi stepped outside his cabin. The night air was cool and clean. Stars filled the sky, more stars than most people ever noticed. He carried a wooden bucket toward the well. 10 steps from his door, he stopped. His head tilted slightly, listening. Footsteps in the woods, soft, deliberate, too careful to be animals, too heavy to be children. 4 sets of feet, maybe 5. They were trying to be quiet, trying to approach unseen. They were failing. Kofi set the bucket down slowly. His breathing didn't change. His expression remained neutral. But something shifted in his posture, something ancient and familiar. A warrior's readiness that came from muscle memory older than this country. He waited. The footsteps moved closer through the darkness. The bucket hung from Kofi's hand. He stood motionless on his porch, head turned toward the pine line. The moon hung full overhead, casting silver light across the clearing between his cabin and the woods. Shadows moved differently there, too deliberate, too human. He counted them silently. 4 men, maybe 5. They thought darkness hid them. They were wrong. Kofi set the bucket down with care. No sudden movements, no panic. His breathing remained steady, deep and controlled, the way warriors breathed before battle, the way he'd been taught decades ago in a place these men couldn't imagine. The footsteps stopped, waiting, testing him. Kofi stepped off the porch. His bare feet touched the cool grass. He wore only his work pants and a thin shirt. No shoes, no weapon, nothing but his hands and the knowledge buried deep in his bones. He walked toward the stable, not away from the danger, toward it. The clearing behind the stable was wider, more open. Better ground for whatever these men wanted to attempt. Kofi moved through the darkness like smoke, silent, purposeful. His height became less noticeable when he moved this way, flowing rather than stomping, gliding rather than marching. Behind him, the footsteps resumed. Closer now, bolder. They thought they were hunting. Kofi reached the clearing and stopped in its center. Moonlight painted everything silver and black. The stable's shadow stretched long across the ground. Crickets sang. A night bird called from somewhere distant. He turned slowly. 4 figures emerged from the tree line. White hoods covered their faces, crude, hastily made. The fabric hung awkwardly on their shoulders. One man's hood sat crooked, revealing part of his jaw. Kofi recognized the scar immediately. They spread out, forming a loose semicircle, trying to look coordinated, trying to look threatening. But their movements betrayed nervousness, uncertainty. One man kept shifting his weight foot to foot. Another's hands trembled slightly. The shortest one, the one in front, stepped forward. Earl Whitlock. Kofi could tell by the walk, by the way his shoulders hunched forward with false confidence. "You been causing trouble, boy," Earl said. His voice sounded muffled through the hood, uncertain despite the words. "Walking around at night, scaring decent folk, acting like you own the place." Kofi said nothing. He simply watched. His eyes moved from man to man, reading their stances, noting their positions, calculating angles and distances without conscious thought. "We come to teach you a lesson," Earl continued. He pulled a length of rope from his belt. "Teach you how things work around here. Teach you to keep your head down and your mouth shut." The man with the limp, Jeb, Kofi remembered, shifted nervously, his hands balled into fists. "Ain't got nothing to say?" asked the third man. His voice was higher. Younger. Frank Brewer, probably. The one who worked at the mill. Kofi's expression remained neutral, empty, a mask that revealed nothing. This unsettled them more than anger would have. "Grab him," Earl ordered. They rushed forward. And Kofi moved. Not with panic, not with rage, with precision so pure it looked almost lazy. The first man, Jeb, lunged from the left. Kofi sidestepped, rotating his body just enough that Jeb's momentum carried him past. No wasted motion, no flourish, just efficiency. Jeb stumbled, confused. He'd expected resistance, expected collision, found only air. The second man, Frank, came from the right, arms outstretched to grapple. Kofi ducked beneath the reach and pivoted. Suddenly he stood behind Frank, close enough to touch. Frank spun around, disoriented, breathing hard. The third man, Clint Ward, the one with the crooked hood, hesitated. His hands dropped slightly. Uncertainty flickered across his visible jaw. Earl shouted something. The words came out garbled with frustration. They tried again. All 3 at once this time. Better coordinated. More desperate. Kofi's training surfaced like muscle memory from a dream. His feet found perfect spacing. His center of gravity dropped. His awareness expanded to include everything. The angle of moonlight, the texture of ground beneath his feet, the rhythm of their breathing. He moved between them like water flowing through stones. Jeb's fist sailed past his ear. Kofi redirected the arm gently, using the momentum to spin Jeb away. Frank tried to grab his shoulder. Kofi twisted, and suddenly Frank's own weight pulled him off balance. Clint attempted a tackle. Kofi stepped aside and guided him down with one hand, almost gentle, so he fell onto soft grass rather than hard earth. No strikes landed. No one got hurt. But Kofi now stood behind all four of them. They turned, panting, confused. Their formations had collapsed completely. They stood scattered and disorganized, staring at the giant they'd failed to touch. Earl's voice cracked. "What the hell? You do not understand what you stirred," Kofi said. His voice was quiet, calm, but something in the tone carried weight that made the night feel colder. The words weren't a threat. They were a statement of fact, a warning from someone who knew things these men couldn't comprehend. Silence followed. The crickets had stopped singing. Jeb stepped backward. His breathing came fast and shallow. Frank's hands shook visibly now. Clint's crooked hood had slipped further, revealing wide, frightened eyes. Earl stood frozen. His rope hung useless in his grip. Kofi didn't move, didn't advance, didn't need to. His stillness carried more menace than violence ever could. "Run," someone whispered. Maybe Frank. They ran. All four of them, hoods flapping, boots crashing through underbrush. They scattered in different directions, abandoning coordination entirely. Pure panic drove them now. The clearing emptied in seconds. Kofi stood alone in the moonlight. He listened until their footsteps faded completely. Until the night sounds returned, crickets resuming their song, wind rustling pine needles, distant water flowing in the creek. Then he walked back to his cabin. Inside, the single room felt smaller than usual. A cot in one corner, a small table and chair near the window, a shelf holding 3 books and a tin cup. Nothing else. Kofi sat at the table. His hands rested flat against the scarred wood. His breathing had never quickened during the confrontation. It didn't quicken now, but his hands trembled slightly. He reached beneath his cot and pulled out a wooden box, plain, undecorated. The lid opened with a soft creak. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in faded cloth. Kofi unwrapped it slowly, carefully, like handling something sacred or cursed. 3 carved wooden symbols emerged, each one roughly the size of his palm. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the candlelight, ancient designs that meant nothing to anyone in Arkansas. But Kofi knew what they meant. The leopard, the symbols of the Asante Leopard Regiment, elite warriors, shadow hunters, men trained from childhood in arts of war that predated European conquest, men who moved like spirits through the forest, men who killed without mercy when their kingdom demanded it. Kofi stared at the carvings. His fingers traced the patterns he'd once carved himself, a lifetime ago, in a place that felt like a dream now, before the ships, before the chains, before the new name and the false history, and the carefully constructed lie of being just a simple, quiet man. The symbols stared back at him, reminders of who he'd been, warnings of who he might become again. Outside, the night continued. Somewhere in the darkness, 4 men ran home to their beds, hearts pounding with unexplainable terror. Tomorrow they would try to explain what happened. Tomorrow they would try to make sense of the giant who moved like wind and spoke like thunder. But tonight, Kofi sat alone with his past. The candle flickered, the symbols gleamed, and the warrior who'd sworn never to kill again wondered how long that vow could last. Dawn broke gray and cold. Kofi stood in the stable doorway, watching mist rise from the fields. His routine began the same as always: feed the mules, check their hooves, clean the stalls, repair whatever needed fixing. His hands moved through familiar motions while his mind remained elsewhere. The wooden symbols sat wrapped beneath his cot, hidden again, but their weight pressed against his thoughts like a stone. He lifted a 50-pound feed sack with one hand, poured it into the trough. The mules shuffled forward, grateful and trusting. They didn't care about his past, didn't care about the men who'd fled from him last night. They only knew he fed them gently and spoke to them with kindness. Tom Bridges arrived an hour later, carrying his own tools. He glanced at Kofi, then looked away quickly. Something in his expression suggested he'd heard whispers already. "Morning," Tom said quietly. Kofi nodded, said nothing. They worked side by side in silence. The usual comfortable rhythm felt strained. Tom kept stealing glances at Kofi's face, searching for something he couldn't name. Kofi noticed, but didn't acknowledge it. By mid-morning, the sun had burned through the mist. Heat began to build. Kofi removed his shirt to work on replacing a broken fence post. Sweat gleamed on his dark skin. His muscles moved beneath the surface like ropes under cloth. And the scars showed clearly. Ritual markings, precise geometric patterns that ran across his shoulders and down his upper arms. Not the scars of whips or chains. Something older, something deliberate. Raised skin forming symbols that meant nothing to most people who saw them. But an elderly man working nearby stopped moving entirely. Kwame Doku had arrived in town 3 weeks ago, hired to help manage the neighboring property's small orchard. He was thin, gray-haired, with hands gnarled by decades of labor. His face carried the deep lines of someone who'd survived what shouldn't be survived. He stood frozen, staring at Kofi's exposed back. His lips moved silently, forming words in a language no one else nearby would understand. Kofi felt the gaze. He turned his head slightly, meeting Kwame's eyes across the yard. Recognition passed between them like lightning. Kwame set down his basket of apples. He walked slowly toward Kofi, his movements careful and deliberate. When he reached the fence, he stopped, studied the scars more closely. His expression shifted through several emotions: shock, disbelief, something approaching reverence. "Obeng," he whispered. The name fell from his lips like a prayer, or an accusation. Kofi's jaw tightened. He pulled his shirt back on, covering the markings. His voice came out low and flat. "You are mistaken, old father. I am not." Kwame stepped closer. His voice remained quiet but firm. "I know the marks of the Leopard Regiment. I saw them once, many years ago, on warriors who came to trade with my village. The patterns are unmistakable. You carry the scars of the shadow hunters, the king's silent blades." Kofi said nothing. He gripped the fence post hard enough that the wood creaked. "How are you here?" Kwame asked. Wonder and horror mixed in his tone. "How did you survive?" "Survival is not the same as living," Kofi replied. Kwame glanced around, ensuring no white ears were close enough to hear. He switched to their shared mother tongue. Words that tasted strange after so many years of English. "You were captured?" Kofi's response came in the same language, rusty but clear. "Betrayed. Sold by men who feared what we represented. Put on a ship when I was barely a man. Given a new name. Taught to pretend I was always nothing more than this. But the training remains. The training never leaves." Kofi's hands trembled slightly. He steadied them. "It lives in the bones, in the blood, even when you wish it dead." Kwame's expression grew grave. "There are rumors already. White men talking in the general store this morning, saying they encountered something inhuman in the dark, saying you moved like a spirit, like a demon. They attacked me unprovoked. I do not doubt that." Kwame shook his head slowly. "But their fear will grow. Fear makes dangerous men more dangerous. And now they suspect you are not what you appear to be." Kofi turned back to his work, drove the fence post deeper into the earth with controlled force. "I let them live. I could have killed them all in seconds. I chose mercy. Mercy they will interpret as mockery." Kwame's voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "You humiliated them. You made them feel powerless. Men like that cannot tolerate powerlessness. They will respond with greater violence to prove their strength. Then what would you have me do? Kofi's voice remained calm, but pain edged beneath the words. Run? Hide? I have done that for years. I am tired of running. I understand. Kwame placed a weathered hand on the fence between them. But you must also understand. If they discover who you truly are, if they realize they face a warrior trained in arts they cannot comprehend, their response will not be to retreat. It will be to gather more men, more weapons, more cruelty. Kofi drove the post one final time. It sank deep and stood firm. Let them gather, he said quietly. Kwame studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I will speak with our people. Warn them. Some will want to protect you. Others will fear what your presence brings. Tell them the truth, Kofi said. Tell them I am a man who wants only peace. But tell them also that I will not run from evil twice in one lifetime. Kwame turned to leave, then paused. The Leopard Regiment was said to never leave survivors when they hunted. Is that true? Kofi's expression remained unreadable. We were what our kingdom needed us to be. And now? What are you now? I do not know yet. Kwame walked away slowly, returning to his orchard work. But Kofi noticed how he stopped to speak briefly with Tom Bridges, how Tom's eyes widened, how the information began to spread, quietly, carefully, through whispered conversations between black workers. By afternoon, the knowledge traveled like wind through dry grass. The giant wasn't just strong, he was trained, dangerous, disciplined in ways white men couldn't imagine. Some felt hope, others felt dread. All felt the weight of knowing their community now sheltered something powerful and unpredictable. Evening fell across town like a curtain. Earl Whitlock sat in the back room of Frank Brewer's house, surrounded by 6 other men, all clansmen, all listening with varying degrees of disbelief as Earl recounted last night's events. He moved like nothing human, Earl insisted. His hands shook as he gestured, like he knew where we'd be before we got there, like he could see in the dark better than we could see in daylight. You saying he's got powers? Jeb asked nervously. His limp seemed worse tonight. I'm saying he ain't normal. Earl's voice rose. And I'm saying he mocked us. He could have run, could have begged. Instead, he let us live, like we weren't worth killing, like we were beneath him. Clint Ward spoke up quietly. Maybe we should leave him alone. Maybe he ain't worth the trouble. Earl's face flushed red. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Leave him alone? You want to let a uppity slave mock white men and walk away? You want the whole county thinking we're cowards? Silence filled the room. Earl paced like a caged animal. His mind churned with humiliation and rage. The fear from last night had transformed overnight into fury, into desperate need to prove his strength. He stopped at the table, struck a match. The flame flared bright in the dim room. He lit the lantern slowly, deliberately. Yellow light spread across the gathered faces. Some looked eager, others uncertain. All watched Earl with the attention given to men making terrible decisions. Next meeting, Earl said, his voice steady now with false confidence. We bring everyone. We organize a proper hunt. We show this bastard what happens when you disrespect white men in Arkansas. Darkness still owned the sky when Kofi's eyes opened. He hadn't truly slept. Rest had come in fragments, broken by the sound of wind through pine trees that reminded him too much of movement, of footsteps, of men gathering in shadow. He lay still on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling beams. His breathing remained steady, controlled, but his mind churned with possibilities, outcomes, calculations he'd hoped never to make again. The air felt heavy with approaching violence. He rose slowly, dressed in the pre-dawn cold. His movements were automatic, pulling on worn trousers, buttoning his shirt, lacing his boots, but his hands paused when they touched the cloth-wrapped bundle hidden beneath his bed. The Asante symbols, the carved wood, the last physical proof of who he'd been. He pulled the bundle out, unwrapped it carefully. The wooden pieces lay in his palm, small and ordinary-looking, yet carrying the weight of an entire identity he'd tried to bury. A warrior who'd killed without hesitation. A man who'd learned to disappear into darkness. Someone trained to end threats before they fully formed. He rewrapped the symbols and placed them inside a small canvas satchel, added a change of clothes, a water canteen, the few coins he'd saved. Everything he owned fit easily into one bag. Running had kept him alive this long. Running had always been the answer. He stood at his cabin's single window, watching the sky begin to lighten from black to deep blue. Pine trees became visible as silhouettes. The world emerged slowly from night. He could be gone before sunrise. Follow the river north. Find another town, another name, another life of pretending to be less than what he was. The satchel sat on his table, ready, but his feet didn't move toward the door. Instead, he found himself thinking of Kwame's weathered face, of Tom's quiet friendship, of the children who sometimes watched him work, their eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear, of the community that had, without knowing his truth, accepted his presence. He was still standing there, motionless, when he heard the voice outside. Sharp, angry, male. Then a woman's voice, quieter but firm, defensive. Kofi moved to his door, opened it carefully. The morning light had grown just strong enough to see by. 50 yards away, near the stable's entrance, Clint Ward stood facing Martha Lane. Martha held her son Isaiah's hand tight. The boy couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Small, thin, with eyes that seemed too large for his face. He clutched a wooden toy horse against his chest. Clint's posture radiated aggression. He stood too close to Martha, invading her space deliberately. His voice carried across the yard. Harboring that thing. You think we don't see you talking to him, smiling at him? I speak to everyone with respect, Mr. Ward. Martha's voice remained steady despite her fear, as I was raised to do. Respect? Clint laughed, harsh and ugly. You protecting the giant makes you part of the problem. You understand that? Isaiah pressed closer to his mother's leg. His small fingers tightened around the toy horse. I ain't protecting anyone, Martha said. I'm just trying to do my work and raise my boy in peace. Peace. Clint spat the word like poison. There won't be peace till that monster's gone. And anyone who stands with him might find themselves gone too. Kofi's hands clenched at his sides. He'd told himself he would leave quietly. Avoid confrontation. Slip away like morning mist. But watching Clint threaten a woman and her child, watching Isaiah's small face fill with confusion and fear, something fundamental shifted inside him. He stepped off his porch. His footsteps made almost no sound on the dirt path, but Martha's eyes caught the movement. Relief and terror mixed on her face as Kofi approached. Clint turned. His expression cycled rapidly through surprise, fear, then false bravado. Well, well, Clint said, voice tight. The giant emerges. Kofi stopped 10 feet away. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. His presence alone changed the entire dynamic. He stood between Clint and Martha. Not aggressive, not threatening. Simply there, immovable as stone. Clint's courage evaporated like dew under sun. He took a step backward, then another. This ain't over, Clint said, trying to inject menace into words that came out shaky. You think you're something special? You ain't. You're just another uppity slave who needs teaching, and that teaching's coming real soon. He pointed at Martha. And you best remember which side you're on, woman. When the reckoning comes, there won't be no middle ground. Clint turned and walked away quickly, his gait stiff with humiliation. Martha exhaled shakily. Thank you, she whispered. He's been watching me since yesterday, saying things, making threats. Kofi looked down at her. She was small, maybe 5'3", but her eyes held steel beneath the fear. Isaiah peeked around his mother's skirt, staring up at Kofi with open wonder rather than fear. "You're really tall," Isaiah said softly. The corner of Kofi's mouth lifted slightly. "I am. Are you really a giant?" "No, just a man." Martha touched her son's shoulder. "Isaiah, hush now." But Kofi knelt slowly, bringing himself closer to the boy's eye level. Though even kneeling, he remained imposing. "You are brave," Kofi said quietly. "Standing with your mother. That is good." Isaiah smiled, small and shy. He held up his wooden horse. "I made this. It is well crafted." Martha's voice trembled. "Mr. Obeng, they're saying you're leaving town. Is that true?" Kofi stood, looked toward the path where Clint had disappeared, then back at Martha and her son. The satchel waited in his cabin, packed, ready. But Clint's threat echoed in his mind. When the reckoning comes, there won't be no middle ground. If Kofi ran, the clan wouldn't simply accept his absence. They'd need someone to punish, someone to make an example of. And people like Martha, people who'd shown him basic human decency, would become targets. Running wouldn't save anyone. It would only determine who suffered in his place. "No," Kofi said finally. "I am not leaving." Martha's eyes widened. "But they're planning something. Everyone knows it. They're organizing." "I know. They'll come for you." "Yes. And you're staying anyway?" Kofi looked at Isaiah's small face, at the trust there, the innocence that didn't yet understand the full weight of the world's cruelty. "I will not run from monsters twice in one lifetime," he said quietly. Night fell heavy and moonless. In the abandoned barn on the eastern edge of town, lantern light flickered through gaps in the warped boards. Shadows moved inside, men gathering, voices rising and falling in heated discussion. Earl Whitlock stood at the front of the assembled group. 15 men tonight, all clansmen, all armed with various degrees of enthusiasm and fear. "We vote now," Earl said. "Do we remove the giant and all who shield him?" Hands rose, not all of them. Some hesitated, but enough, more than enough. 2 nights from now, Earl continued, we gather with torches. We end this. We show every slave in this county what happens when they forget their place. The vote carried. The decision made. Plans formed in that barn. Ugly plans, violent plans, plans that would leave blood and ash in their wake. Kofi walked the perimeter of his cabin slowly, a small knife in his hand. The blade caught starlight as he moved from tree to tree, making subtle marks in the bark, notches that looked like nothing to untrained eyes, random scratches, woodpecker damage, but to someone who knew how to read them, they told a story, created a map, built a network of warning signs that would alert him to approaching danger, old skills, ancient techniques, methods taught to young warriors learning to protect villages from raiders and slavers. He hadn't used them in years. Now they returned like muscle memory, automatic and precise. He marked the northern approach, the eastern path, the southern clearing, each notch carefully placed, each position calculated for maximum awareness. When he finished, he stood at his cabin's door and studied the darkness. Somewhere out there, men planned his death, but they didn't know they were planning their own humiliation. They didn't know they were walking into the territory of something far older and more dangerous than their fear-driven rage. Kofi touched the scars beneath his shirt, felt the raised patterns. The leopard regiment never left survivors when they hunted. But Kofi was trying to be different, trying to be better. The question was whether the world would allow him that choice. Kofi finished his breakfast as dawn broke, cornmeal mush and weak coffee, eaten standing at his small table. The food sat heavy in his stomach, but he needed the energy for what came next. He stepped outside. The morning air smelled of pine sap and coming rain. Dew clung to every surface, making the world glisten. Without a word to anyone, he walked toward the tree line. The woods swallowed him within minutes. His footsteps made no sound on the soft forest floor. Years of living small and quiet had taught him how to move through the world unnoticed, but his warrior training went deeper, teaching him how to read the land itself. He studied the ground carefully. Fresh boot prints crossed the deer path heading east. 4 sets, heavy impressions that told him the men moved carelessly, confident in their numbers. Kofi followed the trail. It led to a clearing where cigarette butts littered the grass, a meeting spot. He counted the different boot patterns. 6 men had gathered here recently, probably last night after dark. He moved on. Throughout the morning, he mapped their movements like pieces on a game board. The clan's routes became visible through broken branches, discarded bottles, and careless tracks. They used the same paths repeatedly, the kind of predictable behavior that made ambush easy. They walked loudest near the old Miller property, used the creek crossing by the fallen oak, gathered at the abandoned barn Earl owned. Kofi memorized it all. By midday, he began his own work. He found Earl's boot print heading toward town and followed it backward, discovering where Earl had entered the woods. There, Kofi created a false trail, pressing his own massive footprints deep into soft earth, leading away from his cabin toward the swamp. Let them waste time searching mud and mosquitoes. Near the creek crossing, he fashioned a simple snare using vine and a bent sapling. Nothing deadly, just a loop positioned ankle height that would catch a boot and yank it clean off. The kind of trap that left a man hopping on one foot, cursing and humiliated. In a tree overlooking Frank Brewer's favorite path, he tied another snare, this one designed to catch a hat and pull it 15 feet into the canopy. Harmless, childish, but effective at creating fear and confusion. The sun climbed higher. Kofi moved to the shed behind Clint Ward's property. The door hung loose on rusted hinges. Inside, tools sat in disorganized piles. Saws, hammers, rope, a rifle that looked older than Clint himself. Kofi took the rope and the rifle. Nothing else. Just enough to notice. Just enough to make Clint question whether he'd misplaced them or whether something else was happening. He carried the items deep into the woods and hid them beneath a fallen log, marking the spot with a subtle arrangement of stones. Throughout the afternoon, he visited 3 more properties, took a hunting knife from one shed, a coil of wire from another, a lantern from a third. Never the same item twice, never everything, just enough to create patterns of doubt. By evening, whispers spread through the white parts of town like fire through dry grass. At the general store, Frank Brewer complained loudly to anyone who would listen. "My hat's gone. Just vanished. Found the string hanging from a tree branch. But the hat itself? Gone. Tools missing from my shed," Clint muttered, checking his purchases twice, as if he didn't trust the shopkeeper. "Rope and my daddy's rifle. Nothing else touched. Just those 2 things." Earl sat at the corner table, nursing a bruised shin from where he'd triggered some kind of snare in the woods. He'd fallen hard, scraped his leg raw, and spent 20 minutes untangling vine from his ankle. He didn't tell the full story, just said he'd tripped, but his eyes held something new, something that hadn't been there before. Uncertainty. The other men gathered around him noticed. Their confidence, so loud and brash just days ago, began showing cracks. In the black part of town, the arguments started after supper. At the Johnson house, voices rose in heated debate. Tom Bridges sat with 3 other families, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Kofi's stirring up trouble," Samuel Johnson said, pacing his small kitchen, "making them angry, making them desperate. That puts all of us in danger." "They already dangerous," Tom replied quietly. "Already planning violence. Kofi ain't changed that." "But he's making it worse," Samuel's wife added, making them feel foolish. Men like that don't forgive being made fools. Kwame Doku, the elderly African man, shook his head. You misunderstand what he's doing. He's not attacking. He's showing them they're vulnerable, teaching them fear. Fear makes them more violent, not less, Samuel countered. Perhaps, Kwame said, but it also makes them sloppy, makes them question themselves. Martha Lane sat in the corner, holding Isaiah close. She hadn't spoken yet, just listened to the others argue in circles. Finally, she said, he stayed for us, when he could have run. He stayed because leaving would have made us the targets instead. The room fell quiet. That don't make it right, Samuel said, but his voice held less conviction. Don't make it wrong either, Tom replied. Kofi heard none of these arguments. He sat on his porch as sunset painted the sky orange and purple, watching the day fade. Small footsteps approached. Isaiah appeared from around the corner, walking carefully with something cupped in his hands. Martha followed a few steps behind, carrying a basket of mending. Mr. Obeng? Isaiah said shyly. Kofi looked down at the boy. Yes? I made something. For you. Isaiah held out his hands. In his palms sat a small carved bird, no bigger than a child's fist. The wood was rough, the details simple, but the shape was unmistakable. Wings spread as if caught mid-flight. I'm not very good yet, Isaiah admitted, but Mama said you might like it anyway. Kofi took the bird carefully, his huge hands dwarfing the tiny carving. He turned it slowly, examining every rough edge and careful cut. It is beautiful, he said quietly. Isaiah's face lit up. Really? Really? Kofi stood and walked to his cabin door. Isaiah followed, curious. Inside, Kofi had a single shelf above his table. On it sat the wrapped cloth containing his leopard regiment symbols, hidden but present. Next to it, he placed Isaiah's bird carefully, positioning it so the wings caught the fading light from the window. I will keep it safe, Kofi promised. Isaiah beamed. You promise? I promise. Martha appeared in the doorway. Isaiah, come now. Let Mr. Obeng rest. But she smiled at Kofi. Tired, grateful, complicated. They left as darkness settled over the land. Kofi lit a single candle. The flame flickered, casting shadows across the walls. Isaiah's bird seemed almost alive in the dancing light, wings ready for flight. Kofi sat at his table, watching the candle burn slowly down. Late the next night, Kofi sat at his table with a length of hardwood across his lap. His knife moved in slow, deliberate strokes, shaving away thin curls that fell to the floor like pale ribbons. The wood was oak, dense and heavy. He shaped it into a spear, not for hunting, but for defense. The blade end tapered to a rounded point, designed to push back rather than pierce. A weapon that could stop without killing. The candle beside him burned low, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, crickets sang their endless song. The night felt thick and still, like the air before a storm. Kofi paused his work, listening. The crickets stopped. He set the spear down gently and stood, moving to the window. Through the gap in the shutters, he saw nothing but darkness. The forest stood silent in a way that meant something had disturbed it. Then came the sound of horses, multiple riders approaching from different directions. Torchlight flickered between the trees. Voices rose, angry, emboldened by numbers. Kofi took a slow breath. He counted the lights. 8 torches, maybe 10 men total. They spread out in a loose circle around his property, cutting off escape routes. Giant! Earl's voice cut through the night, slurred slightly with drink. Come out here! We know you're in there! More voices joined in, shouting, cursing, the kind of noise men made when they needed courage from each other. Kofi looked at the spear on his table. He left it there. Instead, he walked to the door and opened it calmly. No rush, no fear. He stepped onto the porch barefoot. wearing only his work pants and a simple shirt. His hands hung empty at his sides. The torches formed a semicircle in his front yard. Flames reflected off white robes and makeshift hoods. Some masks fit poorly, showing glimpses of familiar faces beneath. Earl stood at the center, closest to the cabin. Frank Brewer and Clint Ward flanked him. Behind them, other men, some Kofi recognized from town, others he'd never seen before. Earl held a rope in one hand and a pistol in the other. The gun wavered slightly, pointing somewhere between Kofi's chest and the ground. "You think you're clever?" Earl shouted. "Stealing our property? Making us look like fools?" Kofi said nothing. He simply stood there, 7 feet of calm silence. "We're taking you in," Earl continued, his voice rising. "Going to teach you proper respect. Show everyone what happens when—" "No," Kofi said quietly. The single word cut through Earl's speech, like a knife through cloth. Earl's face twisted with rage. "What did you say?" "No," Kofi repeated. Same tone, same volume. "Grab him!" Earl screamed, waving the rope. "Take him down!" 2 men rushed forward. Jeb Toller and a younger man Kofi didn't recognize. They moved clumsily, expecting Kofi to run or fight back with wild panic. Instead, Kofi waited. The first man, Jeb, reached for Kofi's arm. Kofi shifted his weight slightly, turning his shoulder. Jeb's momentum carried him forward into empty air. He stumbled, off balance. The second man grabbed for Kofi's waist. Kofi stepped backward, guiding the man's own force past him. The attacker crashed into Jeb, and both men fell to the dirt in a tangle of limbs. "Useless!" Earl roared. He charged forward himself, pistol raised like a club. Kofi moved. 3 movements. That's all it took. First, as Earl swung the pistol downward, Kofi caught his wrist mid-arc. His grip was iron, stopping the blow completely. Second, Kofi twisted Earl's arm outward, using leverage instead of strength. The pistol fell from Earl's hand, landing harmlessly in the grass. Third, Kofi stepped behind Earl and swept his legs. Earl went down hard, face first, into the dirt. Before he could recover, Kofi placed one knee gently but firmly between Earl's shoulder blades, pinning him completely. The entire sequence took less than 5 seconds. Earl thrashed beneath him, shouting muffled curses into the ground. Kofi applied just enough pressure to keep him still. Not enough to hurt, but enough to show absolute control. The other clan members stood frozen. Their torches trembled in shaking hands. They had expected a fight, expected resistance they could overwhelm with numbers. Instead, they watched their leader, the man who'd organized this raid, who'd promised them easy victory, subdued as effortlessly as a child. Kofi looked up at them. His expression remained neutral. No anger, no triumph, just calm certainty. "Leave," he said. Nobody moved. Kofi increased the pressure slightly on Earl's back. Earl gasped, more from shock than pain. "Leave," Kofi repeated. Frank Brewer took a step backward, then another. His torch dipped lower. Clint Ward followed. Then Jeb. Then the others. The semicircle broke apart. Men scattered toward their horses, their torches bobbing wildly in the darkness. "Cowards!" Earl screamed from beneath Kofi's knee. "Get back here, all of you!" But they were already riding away. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the forest in every direction. Kofi waited until the last torch disappeared. Then he stood, releasing Earl. Earl scrambled to his feet, panting. His white robe was covered in dirt and grass stains. His hood hung askew, revealing his face fully, red with humiliation and rage. He grabbed for his pistol, but Kofi was faster. He stepped on the weapon, covering it with his bare foot. "Leave," Kofi said again. Earl stared up at him. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Raw, animal fear. The kind of fear that came from realizing how badly he'd miscalculated. Then Earl turned and ran. He stumbled twice before reaching his horse, mounted clumsily, and kicked the animal into a gallop. Kofi stood alone in his yard, surrounded by scattered torches still burning in the grass. He collected them one by one, extinguishing each flame carefully. The crickets began singing again. Dawn approached slowly. The sky shifted from black to deep blue to pale gray. Kofi sat on his porch, watching the horizon. He heard the last of the riders disappear into town, disorganized, scattered, their formation completely broken. They had come as a unified force. They left as frightened individuals. He knew this wasn't over. Men like Earl didn't accept humiliation quietly. They transformed shame into rage, and rage demanded satisfaction. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed. The new day began. Kofi remained on his porch, barefoot and still, waiting for whatever came next. The next afternoon brought heat that pressed down like a heavy hand. Kofi walked beside Martha's small property, carrying fence posts over his shoulder as if they weighed nothing. Martha's home sat at the edge of the Black Quarter, a modest structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch, but clean and well kept. A small garden grew beside it, carefully tended despite the poor soil. She watched from the doorway while Kofi worked, one hand shading her eyes from the sun. Inside, Isaiah napped on his cot, exhausted from playing all morning. "You don't need to do this," Martha called out. "I can manage." Kofi drove another post into the ground with 3 firm strikes of his mallet. "The fence needs fixing," he said simply. The truth was different. The truth was that Kofi couldn't stay still. His body still hummed with leftover tension from the previous night. Every sound made him turn. Every shadow drew his attention. He had humiliated Earl Whitlock in front of his men, had made them run like frightened children. He knew what came after humiliation. He knew revenge. But he didn't share these thoughts with Martha. Instead, he worked steadily, repairing the broken sections where her fence had rotted through. "Isaiah keeps asking about you," Martha said, stepping into the yard. "Wants to show you his new carving." Kofi paused, wiping sweat from his forehead. "What did he make?" "A fish, I think, though it might be a boat." She smiled softly. Hard to tell with his hands still so small. The image of Isaiah's small fingers working the wood brought an unexpected warmth to Kofi's chest. The boy saw him not as frightening, but as a friend, as something good. "I will look when he wakes," Kofi said. Martha nodded, then hesitated. "People are talking. About last night." "Let them talk. They're saying you made the clan look foolish. They made themselves foolish." "Kofi," Martha's voice grew serious, "these men don't forget. They don't forgive." He drove the final post into place. "I know." She studied his face for a long moment, then sighed. "I need to fetch water from the well." "Watch the house?" "Yes." Martha took her bucket and walked down the dirt path toward the community well, 200 yards away. Other women gathered there, washing clothes and sharing news. Kofi continued working, tightening the wire between posts. The fence would hold now, strong enough to keep animals out, at least. He had just finished when he smelled it. Smoke. Not cooking smoke. Not the clean scent of a hearth fire. This was different. Thick and wrong, carrying the chemical tang of kerosene. Kofi turned. Black smoke poured from Martha's roof. Flames licked up the side of the house near the back window, spreading fast across the dry wooden shingles. He dropped his tools and ran. "Isaiah!" The shout tore from his throat before he realized he'd spoken. He reached the front door and kicked it open. Heat blasted outward, singeing his eyebrows. Smoke filled the interior, turning everything gray and choking. "Isaiah!" Kofi bellowed into the darkness. No answer. He pushed inside, crouching low where the air was clearer. The small main room was already engulfed. Flames crawled across the ceiling like living things, consuming everything they touched. Kofi moved toward the back room where Isaiah slept. The doorway was blocked by fallen debris. Part of the ceiling had collapsed, creating a barrier of burning wood. He grabbed a smoldering beam and hurled it aside, ignoring the pain in his palms. More debris. More flames. Isaiah! Movement caught his eye near the front door. Martha stumbled into the house, screaming her son's name. Kofi caught her before she could rush toward the flames. "Get outside!" he ordered, pushing her back. "My baby. He's in there. Isaiah!" Kofi forced her through the doorway. She fought him, clawing at his arms, trying to get past. He held firm, knowing that if she went inside now, they would lose them both. "I will get him," Kofi said, meeting her eyes. "I promise." He turned back toward the house. The front wall groaned, timbers cracking under the heat. The whole structure was minutes from collapse. Kofi charged toward the back room again. He tore through the burning debris with his bare hands, throwing aside everything in his path. His skin blistered. His lungs screamed for clean air. He reached the doorway to Isaiah's room. The ceiling had already fallen there. The small cot was buried beneath smoking rubble. Kofi threw himself at the pile, digging frantically, pulling away board after board. His fingers found fabric. Isaiah's shirt. Kofi pulled. The body that emerged was too small, too still. Burns covered the child's arms and face. His chest didn't move. "No," Kofi whispered. "No, no, no." He gathered Isaiah's body and ran. The front wall collapsed behind him as he cleared the doorway, crashing down in an explosion of sparks and flame. Kofi laid Isaiah on the ground in the yard. Martha dropped to her knees beside her son, her screams cutting through the afternoon air like broken glass. Kofi stepped back, his hands shaking. Burns covered his palms and forearms, but he didn't feel them. Didn't feel anything except the weight of failure crushing down on his chest. Other people arrived. Neighbors running from their homes, Tom Bridges, Kwame Doku, old women and young men, gathering around the burning house with buckets of water that would do nothing now. Someone pulled Martha away from Isaiah's body. She fought them, reaching for her son, calling his name over and over until her voice broke. Kofi stood frozen, watching. His mind replayed the moment he'd reached Isaiah. The stillness, the silence where a child's breathing should have been. Tom appeared at his side. They found torch marks at the back of the house. Kerosene splashed on the walls. This wasn't an accident. Kofi already knew. He had smelled the accelerant beneath the smoke. "The clan," Tom continued quietly. "They did this while you were out front. While everyone could see you weren't involved. Calculated. Deliberate. A message written in fire and death." The house continued burning. People formed a line, passing water buckets that barely touched the flames. The structure was already lost. They were saving it from spreading to neighboring homes. Someone found something in the rubble. A woman's voice called out, "Miss Martha, I found something." She brought over a small object, blackened and partially melted. Isaiah's wooden bird, the toy he had carved and given to Kofi just yesterday. The woman placed it in Martha's hands. Martha stared at it, her face empty of everything except grief. Then she collapsed completely, her body folding inward like paper in flame. Kofi caught her before she hit the ground. He held her while she wept against his chest, her burned hands clutching the charred toy. The community gathered closer, silent witnesses to a violence that had finally crossed a line even they couldn't accept. Kofi felt something break inside himself, some fundamental restraint that had held his warrior nature in check. He had believed that mercy could protect them, that showing strength without violence would be enough. He had been wrong. Isaiah's death was the price of that mistake. Martha's weeping slowly faded to exhausted silence. Others helped carry her to a neighbor's home, wrapping her burns in clean cloth, giving her water she couldn't swallow. The afternoon sun began its descent toward evening. The fire burned itself out, leaving only smoking ruins and the smell of destruction. Kofi stood alone amid the ashes. Night fell heavy and complete. The community dispersed to their homes, speaking in hushed voices about vengeance and justice. and whether there was any difference between the two. Kofi remained at the ruins. He held Isaiah's burned toy in his scarred hands, turning it slowly. The wood was still warm. The bird shape was barely recognizable now, just a blackened lump that might have been anything. But Kofi remembered what it had been. Remembered Isaiah's proud smile when he'd presented it. Remembered the boy's small fingers and bright eyes and complete trust. The clan had taken that, had burned it to ash, and called it a lesson. Kofi closed his fist around the toy. His vow of restraint died with Isaiah. His promise to avoid violence crumbled like the burned house behind him. He had tried mercy, had tried showing them he could stop without killing, had given them every chance to walk away. They had answered with the murder of a child. The forest watched him in silence. The moon rose cold and pale. Kofi did not sleep, did not move from his position among the ruins. He simply waited for dawn, the moment he would begin. Dawn had not yet broken when Kofi rose from the ruins. His body moved with purpose now. No hesitation, no conflict. The night had burned away everything soft inside him. He returned to his cabin and gathered what he needed. The old cloth bundle came down from its hiding place. Inside lay the tools of his former life, carved symbols, ritual markings. A small blade meant only for cutting rope and preparing snares. He did not need weapons. His hands were weapons. His mind was a weapon. The forest itself would become a weapon. Kofi changed into darker clothes, simple work pants and a shirt that would blend with shadows. He wrapped his ritual scars with cloth strips, not to hide them, but to protect them from branches and thorns. The Asante Leopard Regiment had taught him many things: how to move without sound, how to read the forest's natural rhythms and use them, how to make fear do more damage than any blade ever could. He had buried those teachings beneath years of quiet labor and forced humility. Now he dug them up like old bones, finding them still sharp and ready. Before leaving, Kofi placed Isaiah's burned toy on his small table. He would return for it. When this was finished, he would give it proper burial under a tree that would grow tall and strong. But first, the reckoning. Kofi disappeared into the pine woods as the first gray light touched the horizon. The forest became his home again. Not the careful, measured movements of a laborer passing through. This was different. This was ownership. Every tree, every shadow, every sound belonged to him now. Kofi spent the morning constructing his network of control. He moved through the woods like water, selecting locations with precision that came from muscle memory older than his time in Arkansas. First, the noise signals. He strung thin vines between trees at specific heights, attached with dried seed pods that would rattle when disturbed. Anyone moving through those sections would announce themselves without knowing it. Second, the vision breaks. He bent saplings and repositioned fallen branches to create natural blind spots, places where a man's eyes would naturally skip over, perfect for concealment. Third, the traps, not killing traps. The Leopard Regiment had dozens of designs meant to capture rather than kill. Snares that pulled feet upward, rope nets triggered by weight, pitfalls lined with soft pine needles that would bruise but not break. He worked methodically, remembering formations he had once practiced with warriors whose names he could still recall: Kwabena, Yaw, Akosua, who could move through dry leaves without making a single sound. They were all gone now, lost to time and distance and the horror of the slave ships. But their teachings remained, and Kofi would use them to protect what they never had the chance to protect: innocent lives under threat from cowards wearing masks. By noon, his network covered 3 square miles of forest. Every major path the clan used for their nighttime movements now lay within his controlled territory. They would not be able to move without him knowing. Kofi climbed a tall pine near the center of his network and settled onto a thick branch. From here, he could see the town, could watch the roads, could wait. The Leopard Regiment's greatest strength had never been direct confrontation. It was patience, the ability to become part of the landscape and wait for prey to walk into carefully prepared ground. Kofi waited. Night fell. The clan moved. 4 men on horseback rode along the eastern trail, heading toward another black family's home. Kofi recognized their silhouettes: Frank Brewer, Jeb Toller, and 2 others whose names he didn't know yet. He descended from his perch, without sound. The noise signals tracked their progress. Rattle, pause, rattle. They were moving slowly, confidently, believing the forest belonged to them. Kofi circled ahead, positioning himself in a blind spot between 2 oaks. He could see them clearly. They could not see him at all. The lead horse triggered the first snare. The rope pulled tight around its front legs, sending the animal stumbling. The rider fell, cursing loudly. The other 3 dismounted to help. Exactly what Kofi expected. He moved behind them while they focused on freeing the horse. A second snare caught Jeb Toller's ankle, yanking him upward until he hung suspended 3 feet off the ground, shouting in panic. Frank Brewer spun around, pulling his pistol. "Who's there? Show yourself!" Kofi stepped from the shadows directly behind the 4th man. Before the clansman could turn, Kofi's hand clamped over his mouth. The other hand applied pressure to a specific point on the neck. The man's body went limp, not unconscious, but unable to resist. "Drop your weapons," Kofi said quietly. Frank aimed his pistol toward Kofi's voice. His hand shook. "You're a dead man walking. Drop them, or I break his neck." The pistol clattered to the ground. Then the others followed. Knives, another pistol, a heavy stick. Kofi released the 4th man, letting him collapse beside his friends. Then he pulled rope from his belt and began binding them with practiced efficiency. Hands behind backs, ankles together. Knots that would hold, but not cut circulation. "You killed a child," Kofi said as he worked. "Say it." Silence. Kofi pulled Frank's bindings tighter. "Say it." "We didn't mean... It was just supposed to scare." "You killed Isaiah Lane. Say the words." Frank's voice cracked. We killed him. God forgive us. We killed him. God does not forgive this, but the law will judge you." Kofi finished binding the 4th man, then cut Jeb down from the snare. The clansmen fell hard, gasping. One by one, Kofi dragged them to the main road. He positioned them in a line, sitting upright with their backs against a fence post. Then he pinned a note to Frank's shirt, written in careful block letters. "They confessed to murder. They burn houses. They kill children." Kofi melted back into the forest before anyone from town could arrive. Sheriff Alan Dixon found them at dawn. 4 grown men bound like hogs, shaking with cold and terror. The note fluttered in the morning breeze. A crowd gathered. Townspeople whispered and pointed. Some looked horrified. Others looked quietly satisfied. Dixon read the note twice, then looked at the bound men. "This true?" Frank's silence was answer enough. The sheriff called for his deputy. "Get them into cells, all of them." As the clansmen were hauled away, Dixon stared at the tree line where the forest began. He saw nothing, just shadows and pine branches swaying in the wind. But he felt watched, judged, and found wanting. The pattern continued. Every night, Kofi hunted. Every morning, another clansman appeared, bound and confessed. Clint Ward, captured near the creek, left tied to the church steps. Earl Whitlock's cousin, found hanging upside down from a tree branch at the town square. 2 more, whose names Kofi learned from their own terrified admissions, deposited at the jailhouse door before sunrise. The town transformed. Fear spread through the clan like poison through roots. Men who had strutted proudly in white robes now jumped at shadows, refused to leave their homes after dark, slept with loaded rifles that did them no good, because Kofi was not there to be shot. He was smoke. He was whisper. He was the judgment they had earned through fire and blood. Rumors multiplied faster than truth. Some said the giant could see in complete darkness. Others claimed he could disappear into thin air. A few swore he was no man at all, but a spirit sent to punish the wicked. Kofi heard the stories and said nothing. Let them believe what they needed to believe. Fear was working better than violence ever could. The clan fractured completely. Members accused each other of being next, of bringing this curse down upon them all. Their unity shattered into paranoid fragments. Kofi watched it all from the trees. On the 7th morning, Sheriff Dixon dragged another bound clansman into the jailhouse, the 12th man captured. The cells were nearly full now. The sun rose orange through fog that hung low across the town, giving everything a dreamlike quality. Or perhaps a nightmare quality. Dixon stood on his porch, coffee cup in hand, staring at the pine woods. Somewhere in those shadows, Kofi Obeng watched the sheriff, watched the town, watched justice finally begin to take shape through methods the law had never bothered to use. The Leopard Regiment's greatest lesson: sometimes the only way to stop monsters is to become what they fear most. Kofi turned away from the town. His work was not finished yet, but it would be soon. The morning sun climbed over a town that no longer recognized itself. By 8 o'clock, the square was filled with people. Not the usual quiet gatherings for market day or church. This was different. This was chaos dressed in Sunday clothes and fear-tight voices. Sheriff Dixon stood on the courthouse steps, trying to restore some kind of order. His deputy flanked him, looking pale and uncertain. Neither man had slept properly in a week. "We need calm," Dixon called out. "We need—" "Calm?" A woman's voice cut through the crowd. Mrs. Sarah Hutchins, the grocer's wife, stepped forward with her hands clenched. 12 men in your jail, Sheriff. 12 confessed murderers. How long have you known what they were doing? Dixon's jaw tightened. The law moves on evidence, not suspicion. Evidence? Another voice joined. This one belonging to Thomas Garrett, who owned the mill. They burned Martha Lane's house. They killed her boy. Where was the law then? The crowd murmured agreement. Angry faces turned toward Dixon, demanding answers he couldn't give without admitting his own complicity through silence. Federal marshals will be here within days, Dixon said finally. When they arrive, they'll want to see a peaceful town, not a mob. That quieted some people. Not because they trusted Dixon, but because the mention of federal attention sparked a different kind of fear entirely. Reconstruction might be officially over, but federal eyes still watched the South, particularly when violence against black citizens made headlines, particularly when entire towns seemed complicit. The possibility of outside intervention terrified them more than any night warrior could. By noon, the transformation had begun. Mayor Robert Cunningham, who had quietly attended Klan meetings for years, stood before the town council and denounced the organization as rogue elements that do not represent our community's values. The hypocrisy was stunning, but it was also strategic. Cunningham understood what was happening. The Klan's power structure had collapsed completely. Their secrecy was shattered. Their members were exposed, confessed, and jailed. Continuing to support them now meant sharing their fate when federal marshals arrived. So he did what men like him always did. He pivoted. He distanced. He rewrote the story to protect himself. These men acted alone, Cunningham declared. Their violence does not reflect the character of law-abiding citizens. Other prominent townspeople followed his lead. Business owners who had funded Klan activities suddenly claimed ignorance. Church leaders who had blessed their robes suddenly preached forgiveness and lawful behavior. Farmers who had ridden alongside hooded men suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. The abandonment was total, and it happened within hours. By mid-afternoon, ordinary townsfolk, embarrassed, afraid, desperate to prove they were not part of the terror, began reporting suspected Klan members to Sheriff Dixon. "My neighbor still has a robe in his barn. I saw Jim Hathaway at one of their meetings last month. The blacksmith made iron crosses for them. I seen him do it." Dixon took every report seriously now, not out of justice, but out of self-preservation. When federal marshals arrived, he needed to demonstrate that local law enforcement had taken decisive action. The cells filled beyond capacity. Men who had terrorized their neighbors now cowered behind bars, begging to be transferred somewhere safer, somewhere the giant couldn't reach them. The town cannibalized itself. Fear replaced loyalty. Survival replaced brotherhood. And through it all, Kofi watched from the forest, learning that sometimes justice requires nothing more than exposing evil to daylight and letting shame do the rest. Earl Whitlock stood in his failing farmhouse, surrounded by the wreckage of his authority. 3 days ago, he had commanded a small army. Men followed his orders, respected his leadership, feared his anger. Now, nothing. Silence. Abandonment. He had tried rallying the remaining loyalists that morning, sent word to 5 trusted men to meet at the old tobacco barn. Only one showed up, a drunken farmhand named Wade, who was too stupid to understand the Klan was finished. "Where is everyone?" Earl had demanded. Wade shrugged. "Reckon they got scared, or got smart. Hard to tell the difference." Earl dismissed him with disgust. Now he sat alone at his kitchen table, staring at the pistol he had placed there. His hands shook with rage and humiliation. Everything he had built was collapsing. His reputation, his power, his entire identity. And it was all because of one man. One impossibly tall, impossibly dangerous man who should have been easy to break. Earl's mind circled the same thoughts over and over. If he could kill Kofi, everything could be restored. The Klan would rally. The town would remember who held real power. Federal marshals would find a dead giant and a hero who stopped him. It was desperate logic. The kind of thinking that happens when a man's entire worldview fractures and he grabs at any possibility that might repair it. But Earl was beyond reason now, beyond strategy, beyond everything except the burning need to hurt the person who had exposed him as weak. He knew Kofi's patterns. The giant walked the mill road every evening at sunset, checking on workers heading home. Predictable, routine, vulnerable. Earl could wait there, hidden behind the old storage shed, with his rifle in clear sightline. One shot, clean kill, justice served. He convinced himself it would work. Had to work, because if it didn't, Earl had nothing left. Sunset approached slowly, painting the Arkansas sky in shades of amber and rust. Earl positioned himself behind the storage shed near the mill road. His rifle was loaded. His breathing was steady. He had done this before. Ambushed deer, shot varmints. Killing was just a matter of aim and timing. He waited. The road stretched empty before him. Dust hung in the air from the day's wagon traffic. Birds called from nearby trees. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. Then he saw movement. A figure walking toward him from the direction of town. Kofi, 7 feet tall and impossible to mistake for anyone else. Moving with that same measured pace. Not hurrying, not afraid. Earl raised his rifle, sighted down the barrel, calculated distance and windage. His finger found the trigger. "Just a little closer," he whispered to himself. "Just a few more steps." Kofi walked slowly down the mill road as the sun touched the horizon. He had sensed the trap an hour ago. The wrongness in the air. The subtle displacement of normal evening sounds. Earl Whitlock's desperation was loud as thunder to anyone trained to read environments. But Kofi did not stop, did not change course, did not show any sign of awareness. He simply walked forward with controlled, deliberate intent. Because he knew Earl needed this confrontation, needed to believe he still had power. needed to feel like the hunter one final time before learning the truth. The storage shed came into view ahead. Kofi's eyes tracked every shadow, every angle, every possible position. And there, behind the western corner, Earl's boot heel visible for just a moment before pulling back. Kofi continued walking, his footsteps steady, his breathing calm. The sun sank lower. Long shadows stretched across the road, and Kofi walked forward, ready for whatever came next. The wooden mill bridge creaked under Kofi's weight as he stepped onto the weathered planks. Sunset had turned the creek below into liquid copper. Birds had gone silent. The air felt too still, too expectant, like the moment before lightning strikes. Kofi kept walking, his footsteps measured, his eyes tracking every shadow along the bridge's edges and the mill building beyond. He knew they were here, could feel their fierce sweat and desperate hatred poisoning the evening air. "Now!" Earl's voice shattered the quiet. 3 men erupted from concealment. Earl from behind the mill's loading door. 2 others, Wade and a wiry man named Curtis, from beneath the bridge itself, scrambling up the support beams. Earl raised his rifle. Wade brandished a rusted machete. Curtis swung a length of chain. They converged on Kofi from 3 directions simultaneously, believing numbers and surprise would overwhelm even a giant. They were wrong. Kofi's body moved before conscious thought directed it. Pure warrior instinct honed over decades of training. He dropped low as Earl's rifle fired, the bullet screaming past where his chest had been a heartbeat earlier. His left hand shot out and caught Wade's wrist mid-swing, redirecting the machete's momentum into the bridge railing where it stuck fast. His right foot swept Curtis's legs, sending him crashing backward onto the planks, hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. Earl tried desperately to chamber another round. His hands shook too badly. The rifle jammed. Kofi rose to his full height. He stepped forward. 1 stride, 2, closing the distance between them with terrible calm. "Please!" Earl stumbled backward. "Please, Kofi's hand closed around the rifle barrel. He twisted it free from Earl's grip as easily as taking a stick from a child. Then he tossed it over the bridge railing into the creek below. Wade yanked his machete free and charged again, screaming. Kofi sidestepped and used the man's own momentum to send him sprawling face first across the bridge. Before Wade could rise, Kofi planted 1 massive foot on his back, pinning him completely. Curtis tried crawling away. Kofi reached down, grabbed the back of his shirt, and lifted him bodily before setting him down hard against the railing. The man's eyes went wide with terror. "Stay," Kofi said quietly. Curtis nodded frantically and stayed. Earl backed toward the bridge's far end. His face had gone pale. Sweat poured down his temples despite the cooling evening air. "You can't," Earl's voice cracked. "You can't just—" "Can't what?" Kofi's voice remained level. "Defend myself? Protect my neighbors? Stop men who burn children alive?" Earl flinched at each question. Kofi advanced slowly. "You believed I would be easy prey, that my silence meant weakness, that my restraint meant fear." "I was protecting," Earl tried. "Protecting nothing." Kofi stopped 3 feet away. "You were feeding your own emptiness with other people's pain." Earl's back hit the bridge railing. Nowhere left to retreat. "Please, don't kill me," he whispered. Kofi studied him for a long moment. This pathetic, trembling man who had orchestrated such horror, who had convinced others to follow his hatred, who had murdered a child to prove his imagined superiority. It would be easy, so easy. 1 push, 1 strike. Justice delivered and finished. But Kofi had made a different choice, had learned that becoming the monster others feared him to be would only prove their hatred justified. "I am not you," Kofi said finally. He reached forward and grabbed Earl by the collar, dragging him away from the railing. Within moments, he had bound all 3 men using the same rope they had brought to hang him. their hands tied behind their backs, their ankles hobbled. Wade whimpered. Curtis wept openly. Earl stared at the ground, all fight drained from him. Kofi hoisted Earl over his shoulder like a sack of grain. The man weighed nothing to him. Nothing at all. "Walk," Kofi told the other two, gesturing toward town. They walked, stumbling and terrified, but obedient. Martha Lane's temporary shelter stood at the edge of the black neighborhood, a small structure built by community members after her home burned. It wasn't much. Just 4 walls and a roof. But it was safe. Kofi approached with his bound cargo as full darkness fell. Lantern light spilled from Martha's window. She emerged when she heard footsteps. Her face still showed healing burns. Her eyes still carried the weight of unbearable loss. "Kofi?" She looked at Earl, then at the 2 men following. Understanding dawned slowly. "You brought them here." "This one," Kofi said, lowering Earl to the ground, gave the order. The others followed. Martha stared down at Earl Whitlock, the man who had orchestrated her son's murder, who had stolen everything precious from her world. Earl couldn't meet her gaze. He looked at the dirt, at his own bound hands, anywhere except into the eyes of the woman he had destroyed. "You could end him," Kofi said quietly. "I would understand. The law might even look away." Martha's hands trembled. Her breathing quickened. For a long moment, rage and grief warred visibly across her features. Then she closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and when she opened them again, something had shifted. "No," she said. "Isaiah wouldn't want that. He saw goodness even in hard things, loved even the mules that kicked him." Her voice broke slightly. "If I kill this man, I lose the part of myself my son knew, the part worth keeping." She looked at Kofi. "Take him to the sheriff. Let the law decide. Let everyone see that we are better than our worst moments." Kofi nodded slowly, respect and sorrow mixing in his expression. He hoisted Earl again and gestured for the others to follow. Sheriff Dixon sat at his desk when Kofi pushed through the jailhouse door. The sheriff looked up, saw the 3 bound men, saw Kofi's implacable expression, and understood immediately what was happening. "Earl Whitlock," Kofi said, dropping the man into a chair. "Confess to ordering the fire." These 2 helped. Dixon rubbed his face wearily. "Confessed to you?" "Confessed to God, and everyone who listened." Kofi placed a folded paper on the desk. Written testimony extracted during the bridge confrontation. Names, dates. Crimes detailed in Earl's own terrified handwriting. Dixon read it. His expression darkened with each line. "You know what this means?" Dixon asked. "Federal marshals, trials, newspaper stories. This town will be examined under a microscope." "Good," Kofi said simply. Dixon looked at the 3 prisoners, at Kofi, at the stack of similar confessions already filling his office. Then he stood and opened a cell door. "Get in." Earl stumbled inside. The other 2 followed. The door clanged shut with terminal finality. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.